heard that School of Motion acquired Mograph Mentor earlier this year, you're going to see some of this previously behind a paywall content be released and accessible on schoolofmotion.com. So keep checking back here for more. Thanks.
Okay, so now that we understand some of those basics around spacing and timing, let's jump into Adobe After Effects and start to put these ideas into action and what this looks like with the graph editor. So we're going to do a ball bounce. This is what I want to see that you can successfully do, is understand this kind of bounce, this kind of ease, and this kind of smashing into animation, and see, get a little bit of muscle memory on what this looks like with the graph editor, as well as talk about the different types of graph editors and issues that you can run into that are common and how we can work around those. So let's go ahead and jump in and do these three animations together. So I want you to go ahead and launch After Effects and start a new project, which I'll do now. Now we want to create a new composition or a new scene. Again, we can click this right here in the center, or we can hit Command N on our keyboard. I'm going to name this comp Ball Bounce 1920 by 1080. I'm going to work at 24 frames per second, and I'm going to make the duration just 7 seconds even. And a black background color is fine. Now, I want to go ahead and get this bouncing motion, and so I want to bring in a shape layer. So I'm going to come up to this top menu here and choose an ellipse. I'm going to bring up the title and action safe so that I can see the very center. I'm going to zoom in, and then I'm going to do what we did before and hold Shift, Option, Command to just bring a perfect circle right out of the center of the composition. And then I'm going to come down to this shape layer, name it Ball Layer, and I'm going to choose to scale that down just a bit. Now, we want to animate this going up and down, so we want to manipulate the position. So we're going to hit P on the keyboard to bring up the position parameter. And before we actually start to animate this, we want to Control-click on the word position. So here in the layer, there's the word position. I'm going to Control-click, and it brings up this submenu where we can say Separate Dimensions. And what this is going to do is, just like we see here, the X and the Y each get their own slider, right? So instead of just having a single keyframe on both values, now we can keyframe these values independently. So that's going to be really useful. In the case of a ball bounce, we really just want to go up and down. So we're just going to use this Y value. So you see it split that 960 by 540 now into two keyframeable values. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to choose now to block in the animation. So I'm going to choose a start pose, and with my playhead here in the timeline at 0, that's where I want to be. I'm going to click the stopwatch on the Y position to set a keyframe. I'm going to go forward a half a second, or 12 frames, and I'm going to bring this value all the way down, and I'm just going to use the title safe here as my ground plane. So I have this really low, kind of extreme ground plane. Now that we've done that, we've got two keyframes, and we're going to see that After Effects is actually showing us all the in-between frames visually. So it's showing us the interpolation, which is another way of saying where each position is on each individual image. Now, in order to change this interpolation, that's where the graph editor comes in. And the graph editor is how we ease and change and create bounces and make things smash into other things, just out of, a simple number of keyframes. So the way that we access this graph editor is right down here in this menu here, next to the timeline, next to the playhead. There's actually an icon for the graph editor. And by default in After Effects, all keyframes come in as linear, which means the spacing is even. So here in this example, we can see it's taking every single in-between frame and just perfectly spacing it out in a totally consistent fashion. And what we want to do is be able to change that, and After Effects gives us some assistance here simply by selecting these keyframes and control-clicking on the keyframes and bringing up a submenu. So After Effects, loves these submenus here, so it's something you have to get used to if you're a little bit newer to AE. But then at the very bottom, we have this keyframe assistant submenu where we go down another level here, and we see easy ease in, easy ease out. We also see an option here to fully reverse our keyframes. We're not going to need to look at that right now, but let's just go ahead and hit easy ease. And then when we go back to this graph editor, we're going to see something different. Before, we just saw a straight line. And right now, I have both the X and Y selected, but I really just want to look at the Y because we separated our dimensions and we only put a keyframe there. And I'm going to bring my mouse over here into the graph editor area, and then I'm going to hit the plus symbol on the keyboard and then the minus button to zoom out. Because we eased these two keyframes, we saw the actual distribution of all these in-between frames change. Now it's really subtle. It still looks pretty linear, right? A lot of these gaps still look, pretty close. But as you look at the extremes here, you can see these final two, these final three are really, really close together. Now we have the ability to come in here and push this. If I go ahead and zoom in here and select this, we see these Bezier handles pop up where we can actually manipulate the in-betweening. And if you look in the interface, you're going to see in real time how that spacing changes. So like in the previous example in Adobe Animate, if we wanted the feeling of it, kind of smashing in like we had where it's, eased on one side and extreme on another, we can actually do that manipulation right here in After Effects. Now, what we're looking for is a bounce. So from the previous example, we basically want to have all our easing at the top and go really, really fast into the ground and then bounce off. So let's see if we can figure that out here with our Bezier handles. And basically, I'm just going to come to this first keyframe, and you see as I start to push this forward and ease out of this side, we're watching the distribution of these change. And now all the frames are coming to the top and there's barely any at the bottom, but we still are eased on this side. So if we actually pull this side here, now we can look at our live view and see, well, that's the distribution that we had in that previous bounce example where all the easing is at the top. And so this right here is the basic idea behind the graph editor, right? It's taking on this idea of doing the in-betweening, where in Adobe Animate, you have to draw every frame. Here in After Effects, it's going to place the frames for you, and you use these graph curves to decide, the distribution of that spacing. So if you can kind of wrap your mind around this and understand this basic idea, then you've got a really good foundation to do a lot of stuff with animation in After Effects. So let's go ahead and push this and try to create a nice looking ball bounce here. Now we have this first pose and then this second pose here. I know then I'm going to want the ball to bounce back up. And here is another great trick in After Effects. Now that I've got some keyframes on my timeline, I can just grab this first keyframe and hit Command C for copy and Command V for paste, and just simply reuse that keyframe really quickly. So now it's coming down and then it comes all the way back up. That's a quick and easy way just to get some more keyframes in there. Then I can go forward to a second and a half and then Command C, Command V, that second keyframe, and now I'm beginning to build my bounce. So let's go back to the graph editor here. There are two graph editors, the speed graph or the velocity graph and the value graph. And the idea behind the speed graph is that the curves represent a velocity speed versus the value graph where the curves and the points within the graph editor correspond to the actual values of the properties, meaning position, scale, rotation, all that kind of thing. There are different use cases for the speed graph and the value graph, and in this class we're going to talk about that a lot and use both. Right now, what we're looking at here in this scene is the speed graph. And the way that we can toggle between these two different types of seeing these graphs is in this menu down here at the bottom, another sub-menu, and we'll see that Edit Speed Graph is checked and Edit Value Graph is not checked. So if we toggle this over by choosing Value Graph, now I'm actually seeing a representation that correspond to the actual value. So you see here within the value graph it says 900 pixels, and over here on the Y position it says 900, and that is the X and Y pixels within the screen. So the 1920 by 1080 with a center of 960 by 540, these actually correspond to what's going on in the scene. So to make that point, if I actually change this point around, it changes its position on the screen. If I'm in the speed graph, however, and I change these points up and down, we'll see it's not actually moving anywhere. It's because I'm just changing the speed or the velocity of the in-betweening on those two keyframes. The next thing you're going to have to really wrap your mind around is getting used to manipulating these Bezier handles. And if I start to move this around, I'm going to see that this Bezier handle is already broken, right? Each of these points, each of these tangents are changing each side of this keyframe totally independently. And if I come look at this one, we'll see that this tangent is broken as well. That can be okay, but sometimes you just might want to get this acting as a Bezier where the handles are attached. And that's why After Effects gives us this submenu down here where we have a couple of conversions. You'll see I'm hovering over, it says convert selected keyframes to auto Bezier. If I click that, then we should now get a Bezier that acts a little bit more like kind of an Illustrator layer, perhaps, where the Bezier handle's changing both sides of the keyframe. So that can be an important distinction to getting what you want. Now, for something like a bounce where we want this, this really eased spacing at the top, and then a bounce into the bottom, and then another ease at the top here, well, then having a broken keyframe is a lot more useful there. Now, if you have an auto Bezier situation and you want to be able to break that tangent, then the keyboard shortcut is to hold down Option or Alt and then grab one of the handles. And that is going to go ahead and break that tangent. And if I want to get it back to an auto Bezier, I'm going to have to come back to this conversion button here at the bottom and turn that back into an auto Bezier. And again, so that's Option or Alt, and you're going to break that tangent. I'm going to Command Z that. Here I see the auto Bezier. So let's go ahead and work on this ball bounce right here in the graph editor. So we've gotten to this point where we've got a couple of keyframes in here. We need to talk now about the work area. So again, I'm going to hit B to designate the beginning of the work area and hit N to designate the end of the work area. Then I'm going to hit Control 0 to do a RAM preview, and I'll take a look at how my bounces look here. So we've talked a lot about spacing and it being super foundational, and it is, but now we need to talk about timing, right? The spacing that we have here, if we actually click on these Y values and we take a look at this spacing here, the overall spacing of the frames is good, but the next question is it too slow? Is it too floaty? Would we like it to be a little bit faster? The questions of timing, and this is just as important really as spacing. And here in After Effects, we don't even need to leave the graph editor. What we can do is go ahead and select all of our keyframes, and we're going to see this region box appear where we've kind of created a selection out of our entire animation, and now this can be scaled, right? So if we say, well, this whole thing feels a little sluggish, I'd like it to be faster, we can change the overall timing. So we're going to go from kind of 1.5 seconds now down to 1 second. If we go ahead and RAM preview that, now we've just sped up the entire animation. We kept the spacing basically the same, but we changed the overall timing. So as animators and motion designers, this is the process, and the question constantly is figuring out good spacing, but then also good timing. What looks good and what's watchable, and what do we think looks best? So I like our faster timing here. I think that looks good. Now what I want to do is move a little bit quicker and stay here in the value graph and create a little bit more, a few more bounces here. So I'm going to come forward to about 1.5 seconds, and just the way that we were able to copy and paste keyframes within the timeline, we can do it right here in the graph editor as well. So I'm going to grab this value here, this keyframe, hit Command C, Command V, and paste that keyframe to this point in the timeline. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring this down a little bit. I'm going to come forward, Command C, Command V. Now I can see my overall timing there isn't really quite right, but that's okay. I'll just use that same region selection tool there and go ahead and tighten this up a bit. Also want to make sure that my timing looks really even there. I'm going to come forward a little bit more, Command C, Command V. Paste this keyframe here. And this is just a great exercise because as simple as this seems, just even doing kind of a simple decaying bounce manually can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's a great exercise. If you're new to animation and new to After Effects, and I'll hit Control 0 to see a little preview here. Now I've got all these keyframes here, and it's another opportunity to kind of play with the timing and see if speeding it up is going to make it feel maybe a little bit more snappy, a little bit more realistic. I actually like that a little bit better. So for me, this really is my process, is kind of blocking in, getting keyframes into place, working on easing, working on curves, trying to think about what that spacing needs to look like, and then constantly tweaking the timing, things faster, things slower, is kind of the final piece of the puzzle there. So I'll just quickly add a couple more keyframes to the end of this bounce here and make sure we're kind of speeding up these bounces, but they're also getting a little bit weaker. I'm going to paste just one more little bounce right at the end, and I'm going to again use that ± command to zoom in a bit and make sure all of these curves are nicely smoothed out. And so there we have it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bounces, kind of decaying down. We were able to get all those keyframes in and use the value graph after we separated dimensions to create this really simple animation. Now, because we separated the dimensions, we could add some keyframes onto our X position as well. So let's go ahead and do that and see if we can add a little bit more visual interest to this animation here. So let's actually choose a start position here in the X. And we're going to see another nice thing about separating those dimensions is, we can move this around freely in the X and that Y animation stays the same. So let's start over here, and I'm just going to grab a tangent somewhere here within the kind of title safe. Actually, let's go ahead and come to this menu here and toggle on proportional grid yet again, and then I'll choose a kind of tangent right here. And I think we're going to get away with way fewer keyframes here in the X, but let's see. Let's just then go to the very final pose here, and then maybe just choose a tangent on that right side there. And so now we get that Y bounce, but it does have some X motion as well. So now we get this fun, cute little bounce from left to right, and I think that's actually looking pretty cool. Now, let's remember that we set these keyframes on the X, but by default, everything is linear, so we need to make sure that this final pose, it doesn't just, totally stop and hit a wall, that it kind of like eases into place here. So let's go ahead and choose this end keyframe and say keyframe assistant, easy ease in. And now we should, we're going to keep that linear spacing out of the front, but let's just ease into that final pose on the X. And we'll see that we need to probably extend that out a little bit, right? Because it looks funny to see all of that X, die down right on the last bounce. So that becomes kind of a timing issue. So let's go ahead and grab our last keyframe on the X position and see what it looks like if we do something like that. Take the final pose out to about 2.5 seconds, where then, it stops bouncing, but then it kind of rolls to a stop. So I think that's looking pretty awesome, actually. I hope that this helped you understand the graph editor and using the value graph. So let's move on and create some more animations and talk about some more use cases and the speed graph and how we can use it in different ways. So let's move on to the next animation.
After Effects Kickstart changed my life.
I didn't know anything about the program, and in just 2 months, I learned everything that I needed to know.
From the get-go, we learned the importance of timing and spacing.
Getting really thorough training, and not just in the software, but in the thinking.
So we did our ball bounce animation, but now let's do an animation where we have an object, smashing in to a wall, and let's talk a little bit more about the speed graph. So without really leaving this project, we can just hit Command N to create a new composition or a new scene. And I'll just title this Smash Into, and 7 seconds is fine. And I need to create an element that I can use here. And so again, I just like to create something right out of the center of the composition, and then find a general scale, and a little bit smaller I think is a little nicer there. And so I'm gonna hit P to bring up my position. I'm gonna separate those dimensions again by clicking on the word position, get this X position, and let's go ahead and just start over pretty far on the left side of the screen here. And so let's just do a left to right kind of animation here where we smash into something. And I'm going to add another element to the scene, just visually. So I'm going to come up here to this top menu and grab the pen tool. And let's just create a single spline. And I'll just use this part of the title safe. And I'll just create 2 points, just a single line, and then I'll hit V to go back to my basic selection tool. And what that's going to do is create a second shape layer here. And we have the option with this shape layer at the very top. You'll see it says fill and stroke, and I'm looking for a stroke here, and we don't need a fill because it's just 2 points, so we can turn that off by actually clicking on the word fill to bring up this submenu of fill options. We can just turn it off. I'm going to bring the playhead back to 0, set a keyframe on the X position, go forward about a second, and then bring this all the way until it actually overlaps a bit, because we're actually going to manipulate this shape and we'll do a little bit of kind of overlap and follow through. But first we just need to block out the animation. And let's grab those 2 keyframes like we did before and bring up the submenu by control clicking and saying keyframe assistant. And then we'll say easy ease. Now for something this simple, just moving something, left to right, we can just use the speed graph, the velocity graph, because we know we just basically want slow and then really fast. So it's really that simple. So the speed graph is a great use case here. So let's go ahead and click on the graph editor. Let's open it back up. But you'll see that what we're seeing actually is the value graph. And that's because we were just working in the value graph previously. But let's go ahead and toggle over it to the speed graph. And let's make sure that we just have the value with keyframes, the X position selected here. So that's all we see. And so again, right, we want really, really slow into fast. So I want to ease way out, and we should be able to see this visually. All those in between frames start to favor and kind of crunch into the left side. And then we need to make sure that it's absolute peak speed at the very end here. So we basically want 100% easing on this first keyframe to 0% on the very end. Now let's go ahead and define a work area so we can see. So I'll hit N to bring the end of this work area in, and we'll see that the basic animation is there, right? It's slow and then it moves. Now to challenge ourselves a little bit further with this animation, let's create a little bit of a kind of absorption animation on this wall here where it kind of feels the impact but absorbs it. So the way that we're going to do that is actually by parenting this basic layer that we just did here with our left to right animation. Now let's go ahead and parent it to this top layer, which is this guy here. And let's go ahead and bring its position parameters up and separate its dimensions. I'm going to leave the graph editor by clicking the icon. And so this will be a nice example of kind of matching animation from one layer to another layer. And it's a very common thing to do. So let's go ahead and make sure we're dealing in the right properties here. So we're going to just work on the X position on this layer as well. And I'm going to line up the last keyframe on the ball here and the first keyframe here, and then kind of move this back. So what we're trying to do with that is say, all right, it's going to slam in, and then this is going to kind of catch itself and then kind of absorb this energy. I think that's a really nice challenge here. So I'm going to grab this first keyframe and Command-C, Command-V. And so basically now I have a linear kind of overlap. But what we want to do is, again, bring up this keyframe assistant menu and ease all of these. And let's try to think now about what kind of easing we would be looking for here as animators. And if we just go ahead and hit play, just with that basic easing, we're going to see that's not really what we're looking for. And that's because we don't want it to just ease perfectly in the center. We actually do want the very beginning of that impact to be the fastest, and then ease at the back, and then come forward again, almost like a ball bounce, almost like we just did with a ball bounce. So we can do that with the speed graph too. So here in the speed graph, let's say, okay, we know we want the impact of this to be towards the front. So we want to ease at the back here and then we want that absolute peak speed to be right when the ball hits. And so if we hit play now that looks a little more correct, right? Now it's kind of catching the energy of this element and matching it. So the speed graph, although it can be for simpler things, is still really, really useful and quick, whereas the value graph can be when you need a little bit more control sometimes, but the speed graph is extremely common as well. So I'm going to clean up this animation, as animators often do here in motion design, with a little bit of compositing. And what I mean by that is I'm going to turn off my title and action safe. I want to mask out the back of this. And so with the ball layer selected, I'm going to come back up to this shape menu at the top, and I'm going to choose the rectangle tool so that I can create a mask. But before I can draw a mask, I need to make sure that I take a look at this menu here, where right now by default it says Tool Creates Shape. I need to toggle it over to say Tool Creates Mask so that I can draw a mask on this shape layer and go ahead and mask that on. And by default here I see the mask and it's set to add, but I want to set it to subtract. And then I'm going to toggle open its properties and set a keyframe on the mask path. And then I basically want to leave the graph editor. I just basically want to have this pop into place right on this frame, but one frame before it, I'm going to double click one corner of the mask and just move it away there. One frame before, I don't want it to be in that pose. So we're also going to add a little bit of compositing animation with a mask there, and that's also a really common thing that we have to do as animators, so that's a great part of this exercise as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at where we landed with this animation. Really snappy, catching this energy, and being able to think about, the speed graph and how that lines up and where you need to ease and where we really want to, feel that impact. So with that, we're going to move on to the next animation. All right, so we did the ball bounce. We did this really fun smash animation that I'm really digging. Let's go ahead and hit Command N to do a new composition. And we'll just call this one Ease In, Ease Out, which is a little simpler, but we'll try to add some cool touches to this one. So I'm going to start with the ellipse tool again, same kind of thing. What we really want to focus on is kind of animation in the graph editor here. And because we had previously set this to stroke, now I'm just producing a stroke, but I do want to come back to that fill and just turn off the stroke there. And again, find my kind of starting scale for this element. And our big goal here is to do kind of an exploration of easing. One of those first examples we talked about in Animate was just, the basic function of things easing in and easing out. And the speed graph and the value graph can help us get there really quickly. So let's make it a little bit more complex by adding a couple more elements to the scene, and we can have a little bit more fun with it here. So let's grab a rectangle. Now, before I go ahead and draw this shape, I need to make sure that I don't have this first shape layer selected. I want to put this on its own shape layer, and I'm going to be okay not drawing all of these out from the center. So I'm going to click away again. I'll add even another small rectangle. I will come to the polygon tool, go ahead and create polygon. Now, if it comes out looking like that, that may be because inside of this polystar path, the outer roundness is really high. That shouldn't happen to you by default. But we can also up the number of points here and create something that looks a little bit more like a polygon. We've got these shapes, and that's kind of fun. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this polystar one last time. So we've now got these 5 shapes, and let's go ahead and change the colors around a bit. So on this first one, instead of green, let's try to choose its complementary color, so something in the kind of red, pink, violet range. Let's go to this one and maybe choose something purple. And instead of green, let's choose something kind of orange. And on this base shape, instead of green, let's choose blue. So this is a good example of animating multiple things at once and then offsetting. This is something that's going to be really common as an After Effects user as well, where let's grab all 5 of these shapes, and I'm going to hit P to bring up the position. And this time, let's not worry about separating dimensions. Let's just go ahead and keep it as is, and we'll set a keyframe here on this first position, then go forward 1 second, and let's just move everything. Oops. Let's just grab the this center anchor point, and we didn't decide to center everything, and that's okay sometimes as well. Sometimes I like not having the anchor point directly in the center of the layer there. And let's just go ahead and move everything down to this bottom right corner. So we're kind of in the middle, then we're at the bottom. Then let's go forward to 2 seconds and add a little bit more to this. Let's come over to this corner here and just do that with each of these elements. And this will just be a good kind of example and exercise on easing multiple things. And it's okay if they kind of overlap and move past each other, because we're also gonna, offset these a bit and just kind of create a nice easing animation. And let's actually just do, let's just go ahead and do one more where they come back to kind of the center of the composition here. So I'm just selecting each of these layers, and we'll just have it all jumbled up. So with all of the keyframes selected here, you can see I just selected everything right down here in the timeline. Again, we're going to rely on that submenu where we can use the keyframe assistant and just ease all of these out. And basically, I think what I'm going to live with here is just they'll be fast through each of the middles, and they're going to ease at each of these poses. So being that simple, we should probably just be able to rely on the speed graph. And right now we're looking at the value graph, and we can see those X and Y values. But since we kept everything together, we didn't separate any dimensions, let's just use the speed or the velocity graph here to do basically what we just talked about, which is to make it fast through the middle and then easing into each of these poses. And right now, all of our keyframes are perfectly aligned, but you're really going to see just how cool and nice it is that even a simple animation like this, once we start to offset some of these layers, is going to look pretty cool and interesting. So let's go ahead and Control 0 and see how we're doing. And so, we're kind of darting around the screen. This is kind of what we're looking for. We're getting a little bit of overlap, which is cool. But it's going to be even cooler, I think, if we just offset these a little bit. So let's just come to this first shape layer and just start manually offsetting here. So we'll say, this will get here 2 keyframes early. I just don't want them to all we can start all on 1 keyframe, but on all these other middle positions here, I think it'd be nice if we just randomized it a bit, right? So it's kind of gonna have a little bit more of a randomized feel here. And this is kind of the beauty of doing it manually. So now we should see a little bit of offset, which is nice there. And we're getting kind of a cool little loop here. Now, as I'm watching this animation, I can see that, the velocity on these, when they hit these poses, they actually go to 0. It's like they sit still and then they start again. And that is represented in the value graph here. So if we come to all of our position parameters here, I'm going to stop this animation for now. We can see that, this bottom line here means 0 velocity. So every time the keyframe, or every time the frame here is at the very bottom, that means that the velocity is at 0, which means it's kind of frozen. And you can feel it in the animation. And so on these center animations, we may want to grab all of these and just lift it up. We basically want to take all of these center, and we need to grab each side of the handle here. And if we just lift those off of 0, we'll see that now actually they don't stop 100%. They do slow down within each of those positions, but now they just kind of move slowly, but there's never a point where it really slows down to 0 velocity. And so this is really the big, kind of takeaway with the speed graph here is it's really just this really simple concept of the velocity. How fast is it moving? And so if we don't want it to be static and frozen at all, we want to just move that up off the 0 line. But we still see we're getting a really nice, cool animation here. Now, a fun detail that we could add to this, we can add some fun motion trails by using what's called the echo effect on each of these layers. So let's go ahead and do that real quickly. I'm going to actually just first select this large blue shape. And in After Effects, it's got a really huge, robust effects panel, and there's so much to look at. And we're just going to barely touch on several things here, but we'll start to go through it little by little. But for now, we just kind of want to skip down to this time submenu here where it says echo. And we're going to add basically duplicates or echoes of this base layer. Now, the echo time is the main part of this effect, and we basically want it to be a really, really small value. So I'm going to say -0.001, and what we're going to see is that actually jumped really close, which is kind of what we're looking for. And the next thing we want to do is look at this number of echoes, where we could start to push that out a bit. And then at the very end here, it says echo operator, and I'm just going to say composite in back. And basically what that means is it's going to create these duplicates and just hide it behind the base layer here. So when this shape slows down, we're not really going to be seeing those echoes. They're going to converge. But when it's moving quickly, when it's moving through these fast parts of its spacing, we're going to see those echoes. And so if we want to actually make that a little bit longer, that's kind of fun. And so now it just kind of has that little bit of motion trail behind it that is really kind of fun. So once we get it dialed in on this first layer, now we should really be able to copy and paste in effects. This is another common thing in After Effects, right? Is just getting your effect figured out on one layer and then just kind of pushing that across our other elements here. So I'm going to, with this shape layer selected, hit Command C, and then I'm going to shift select the other 4 layers and hit Command V. And that is going to go ahead and add that echo effect onto each of those layers. And so now we're going to get this really fun kind of smearing, and with the square, it almost looks, a little 3-dimensional, which is kind of fun. So with that really simple animation, just doing everything at once, we end up with actually something really cool and really visually pleasing. But what underpins this is that basic example that we go back to of easing in and easing out, of just giving the audience dynamic motion. That's really what animators and motion designers are trying to do, is to give that feeling of dynamic motion. And so ease in, ease out is really a foundational concept, but hopefully this exercise here gives you a sense of how even that simple concept can yield a really cool, nice looking results. But hopefully this helps you take another step forward here with Adobe After Effects.